Hey everyone, I'm Greg Galant, the co-founder and CEO of Muck. Really excited to bring everyone together and have another Muck live session, this time talking about a very important topic, local news and how that's playing out in 2021. We have two great panelists who I'll introduce shortly and who are going to help analyze this all with me. But first, I'm just going to share some stats about what's going on in the world of local news. And even before I do that, though, I want to invite you all to send in your questions, no matter what platform you're watching. And we are live streaming this on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube, pretty much everywhere except for Clubhouse. But we'll work on that soon. But wherever you're watching, just write a comment or a tweet, hashtag MuckRackLive. We'll pull your questions in. I'll ask your questions to our great panelists today. So with that, let's get started with the stats. And first, you can see here that newspaper circulation has fallen to its lowest level since 1940, and this metric's only up until 2018. So you can only imagine, how that's been playing out in 2019, 2020, and now in 2021. But it's an accelerating trend that we've been seeing for a while. Then we've also seen, unfortunately, a lot of layoffs happening in local newsrooms and a lot of those jobs going away. Again, this stat only goes to 2018, and we know that a lot of these newsrooms have been decimated since the pandemic, and just with a lot of the trends of the business model of local news breaking down. Finally, if you're tuning in today, you probably know about this, and in journalism world, in the journalism and PR world that we all exist in, this is something we talk about a lot. But it's something that Americans in general haven't had too much awareness of. And again, this stat's pre-pandemic, so there might be some more awareness of it now. But while it's so top of mind in our media world, it's still something that isn't fully understood in the general public. Yet we've seen people are more interested in local news than ever. And we've seen that even more people are interested in only state and local news more than national level news, largely due to COVID. This stat's all about COVID, and it makes sense because COVID's like this kind of first time we have a worldwide story where it's different in every locality. So everyone's dealing with COVID, but every city, every state has your own set of restrictions around COVID and different effects from the disease. So it's something where we're seeing that local news is so challenged, yet so essential. And that's why we wanted to bring together two experts to dissect all of this with me. And first, I'd like to introduce Tamar. It'd be great if you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do.
Thanks, Greg. Glad to be here. I'm Tamar Charney. I'm the Acting Senior Director for Collaborative Journalism at NPR. So I work with 260 member stations around the US and NPR to figure out the best ways that we can work together to bring communities all across the country local news. Before that, I was working on a project at NPR called NPR One, where we were trying to get local news from the stations into apps and smart speakers and all of the new ways that people get their local news. And prior to that, I worked in public radio in local markets in Michigan for about 20 years.
Great. And Kristen, great if you could introduce yourself too, and welcome on to the show.
Thanks, Greg. Hi, Tamar. I am Kristen Hare, and I'm a reporter and editor at the Poynter Institute. I cover the business and people of local news. Before 2020, that meant covering digital transformation, new business models, and some of the exciting ways that even legacy newsrooms were evolving. But as of last year, that beat really turned to survival. Before coming to Poynter, I spent 10 years working in local newsrooms in Missouri.
Great, and let me just throw out the first question, which is, what does this all mean for, both, what mechanisms there are to combat disinformation on a local level, and then also just what it means for, democracy on a local level, where once we're past, it's challenging enough on a federal level, but for, local elections and politicians, like how do how are people making sense of things now with these, weekend local newsrooms and this new media landscape that we're in?
That's a great question. Before COVID, we had some great studies, one of them from PEN America, that cite a lot of different studies that show that when there is less local news, fewer people vote, fewer people run for office, and just in general participate in local democracy. There is a great project out right now from the Post and Courier in Charleston that shows what happens in news deserts and places with weak ethic laws. And so, local news is not always the sexiest news. I think people tend not to think of it as, the pinnacle of our industry, although I would disagree. I think it's some of the most valuable work out there, but it's also kind of the backbone of democracy and among the work that has to get done at the local level in order to hold, politicians and the government accountable as you go up the food scale.
I do think that while it might not be, considered like the pinnacle of the news industry, I think the audience does recognize that what local news covers are really important issues to them. It's the state of their roads. Is their water safe to drink? What's happening in the school system? And I think by nature of that, it's really valued. And I also think they know they don't get it from the national news media. And it's one of the reasons that local audiences value the few remaining local providers that there still are, because they know there aren't a lot of other places to get local news. So I think there is this recognition by the public that it's needed, because they do want to know what's happening in their community and in their schools, and is the water safe to drink and the road safe to drive on? And those are issues that hit really close to home for people.
And I think I would just add, Greg, never before has that, I think, been as clear to people than during the pandemic, when they wanted to know, is it safe to go to the store? What is the infection rate in my neighborhood? What's going to happen to my kids' schools? CNN and the New York Times and the Washington Post can't tell me those things. And so there was even more, if those of us who have been cheerleaders and supporters and advocates for local news, before 2020, I think are no longer, it's not a small group anymore of people who really see in real time the value at a survival level of local news.
And Kristen, I think that's so spot on. It is about survival. It's not about abstract issues about democracy or, other things that feel a little bit more ethereal. This really is it safe to send my kid to school? Is it safe for me to go there? And can I get a vaccine? These are very tangible issues that really hit close to home for people.
Kristen, you mentioned the term news desert. Can you tell us a little more about what that means, and then where they exist, how many there are? What the landscape's like? Yeah,
so news deserts are places, that have generally newspapers that have closed down. And Penny Abernathy, formerly at UNC, has been tracking this for years. But news deserts are places that, like food deserts, have either no or very few choices for local news. I have tracked for Poynter the closure of local newsrooms during the pandemic, and I think we're up to 70 or 71 now of places that no longer have, newsrooms or places where newsrooms have closed or merged specifically due to the pandemic. So, and then there's another great term, I did not coin this, news donut holes. And I think these are just as common. These are places, outside of major metro areas. I live in one of them where the local newspaper doesn't cover that area as much as it used to. They probably don't have reporters at the school board meetings or, covering the hyper local issues that weeklies used to cover before they got bought up by the major metros.
Yeah, what are you seeing now in terms of combating these news deserts? Like, it seems like, on the other hand, there's been more money, more nonprofits getting started than ever, more foundation money coming, even some of the social networks trying to, put money to work, and you can debate the motives, but there's more money going into it. Do you think that's anywhere near enough to make up for it? And are there glimmers of hope in any of this?
I see a lot of glimmers of hope. I see a lot of, glares of hope, frankly. And, Axios just did a piece, I think last week, that it was a really good year for nonprofits last year. There were a lot of new ones launched. INN and Lion members, I think, are stronger than ever. I think it's hard, you're comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing, 200-person newsrooms to 2 to 3 people's shops. But is there someone there who's getting it started again? Yes. There's great projects like the American Journalism Project, which is helping to give some runway to some existing local newsrooms that have shown promise, and great partnerships like ProPublica's Local Reporting Network and the work that NPR is doing with its local stations that are, focusing on really reconnecting newsrooms and their communities and building networks to help journalists do that in new ways.
Yeah, and what do you think, Tamar? Are there initiatives that you're excited about, and are you following any of these nonprofits you think are making a big impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think not everybody, but there are many folks, trying to figure out how do we solve this problem and what can be done to pick up the slack, when newspapers consolidated and had layoffs. And definitely public radio has for many years been trying to figure out how to solve that problem, because we do have reporters all across the country, boots on the ground. So this is why collaborative journalism has been such a such a project that we're so invested in, because we're really trying to come up with new ways that we can work together from NPR with the member stations all across the country, but also to inspire partnerships with some of the nonprofit media newsrooms and other outlets in community. So, we can figure out how do we band together to really make some meaningful differences in this area. But I have to be honest, it's hard because there isn't a clear financial model for it yet. There's definitely the model that public radio has had with listener support and philanthropy. But, nothing is quite come in yet to fill the gap that the newspapers left behind. And there was such a clear funding model back in the day when advertising was really strong. So I think, there's a lot of experiments happening in a lot of different places, and we're all trying with different shots on goal to solve the problem. But I don't think there's been one solution where it's like, okay, yeah, this is the way forward and this is going to make the difference and get every single community the local news that it needs. We're just not there yet. So I'd say it's very much a work in progress.
We've got a lot of great questions coming in from our audience. And just as a reminder for anyone who tuned in late, no matter what platform you're watching through, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, etc., just send a message, #MuckRackLive. We'll pull it into this platform, and I will ask our panelists. And let me start with one from Daria and Ria. Asking, what does the average day of a local news reporter look like? How did it change during COVID? I know neither of you are currently local news reporters yourselves, but you're talking to them all the time. How's their day changed due to COVID?
It's changed. Gosh, for one thing, they're not going into the office. I'm sorry, Kristen, go on.
No, that's okay. And I actually am a local reporter. I work with the Tampa Bay Times to write feature obits. And so I'm in their Slack, and before the pandemic was in their newsroom. And so do really have a sense of what they've been through. So the biggest change has been that, everybody's beat is now COVID. And, for a long time, especially early days of the shutdown, that meant that sports reporters were having to rethink what they did. We did a piece about a reporter in California who was a food critic who changed his work to offer COVID comfort ratings. So, everything, the pandemic changed the shape of everyone's work. And then you add in, George Floyd's death this summer and the work around the country and the world to, better serve communities of color and the reckonings within newsrooms themselves that have for a long time not reflected their own communities. So last year was, basically a never-ending breaking news cycle. And I think everybody is pretty worn out. I'm hearing a lot of people are missing their newsrooms right now, and just the camaraderie. But the work itself has been particularly relentless. And I haven't even mentioned the election or the insurrection. So it's been a lot.
It's been unrelenting. I think the other piece that's really different now is when we would send reporters, overseas into war zones, we would outfit them with helmets and, bulletproof vests. This is something that's now having to happen here in this country as folks are covering, protests. There has been so much more emphasis, at least in public radio, on field safety, both in terms of how do we keep folks safe from COVID, but also how do we just in general keep our journalists safe in the field. And this is not something that I think many shops used to worry about, but it's a day-to-day reality right now.
Yeah, definitely a wild thing to consider. And I think with that, we have an interesting question from Carolyn Carson asking, how do you keep local news publications alive when national news receives so much more coverage and attention? In other words, what's the selling point for local consumers? So, I think like we were talking about that tension between the national story, how it affects locally, but what's your pitch when there are these huge national stories that we've seen, and it's hard to think about, well, what's happening in my neighborhood when you see something going on in the Capitol and some big national story?
I guess, though, I would say for the people who live in that community, what's happening at the Capitol is super important. And I think when you're talking writ large across the country, yes, you can say, okay, what's happening in Washington might be more important to everybody in the US than what's happening in one single market. But if you're in that one single market, the decisions your state capital is making, the decisions your city council is making, the decisions your school board is making really do affect people's lives in ways that they truly understand. And I actually don't think it's that hard a case to make to people within the market. I mean, one of the things we have learned as we've been mixing local content in with national content is we actually see higher engagement levels when the national and the local is mixed together, because I think people realize there aren't a lot of places to get local news. So they see that as an added value. And again, because they really care about these issues. I mean, people really do want to know if their roads are safe to drive on and schools are doing a good job educating their kids. These are home and hearth issues that people get and they respond to.
I would also add that all news is local. It always starts local. And so most of the news that people are hearing is often, they may be hearing a story from or seeing a story or reading a story from a national level, but it was probably reported on first by a local journalist. So, my pitch to people is always go find the original source, and the original source is going to be a local reporter. And the work that they're doing is intensely connected to the community. We have so many great examples of this, but a really great recent one is, I don't know that national journalists are going to help you get a COVID vaccine, but local journalists are. There's a journalist at the Tallahassee Democrat who has been a source for seniors for months now, helping them figure out how to get, registered for a COVID vaccine. And there's a newsletter in New York City that serves Queens, Jackson Heights neighborhood. They have now helped 200 people get appointments to get vaccinated. So, that's an easy sell for me. There's a real value, not just to support the work of your neighbors, buy local, read local, but also that you're going to get the closest to the ground version and view of what's actually happening.
And I think because local journalists are local, they know what people in their area care about because they live in that area too. Mm-hmm. So I think in some ways, the local journalists are so much more tied into what people care about and what questions they need answered. So in some ways, it's almost so much easier for that journalism to be relevant and to be recognized as relevant in people's lives.
We have another question from Bailey Can asking, what is something you wish you could do to help local stations? So in general, what else do you wish could be done to help all these local newsrooms?
Oh, I mean, the one thing local newsrooms need more than anything are more reporters, honestly. There used to be huge 100-person newsrooms from the newspapers in all kinds of markets, and public radio and radio stations just don't have that level of staffing. So I think boots on the ground is super important. And I think if I was to name one thing that would make the biggest difference, it's just more journalists.
I agree with that. And for me, the one thing that I think would make everything better would be to pay local journalists better, and not just a living wage, but one that is competitive and makes them want to stay in their town where they live, where their kids go to school, where they maybe have family or have some roots set down. That has been a problem for a long time. Local journalism is often, I think all journalism is often seen as a calling. And so we sometimes accept unacceptable language around the sacrifices that we have to make in order to, do this work. And it's noble. But if you can't pay your bills, if you can't afford your childcare, then it is maybe not worth the sacrifice. And so, paying local reporters better money in order to keep them and retain them, I think would be, if I could wave a magic wand, that would be the thing I would do.
Great. Well, hopefully you all get your magic wands soon enough. We have a question from Lisa Kovitz, who's an old friend of mine, asking, what does the panel think about the Patch Network and the potential for Nextdoor for creating local news?
Patch has been, a staple for a long time, and it's been through a pretty big transformation. And journalists in, local Patch newsrooms are doing great work. Nextdoor is different, and I am plugged into the Nextdoor here in Florida where I live, and it feels more like Facebook, where it is, a great place to get tips, and also see gossip and rancor. And so, for me, it's a place to have as a source. And as far as I know, Nextdoor is not yet willing to work with actual local journalists. So, I appreciate any place where journalists can interact with their communities, especially when we can't be doing it much in real time. But I still think we need, professional journalists on platforms where they have some control to, make sure that what they're doing is real and verified and really valuable to their community.
Right. So that it's just not, profiting in disinformation. I think that's the concern.
Mm-hmm.
Great point. We have a question from Jeffrey Good saying, I'm intrigued by the term emerging localized media. Do you mean new hyperlocal outlets? Asking, has Poynter or anyone else compiled a directory of these outlets? And finally, as traditional outlets fade, are these kind of the new outlets that people will be looking for?
We don't have a directory ourselves. And one of the reasons is that is, it's very much an alive entity that is, it's an organism that is constantly changing and growing. But the best places to get a sense of some of the emerging local media, particularly for-profit and nonprofit that is online only, is the Institute for Nonprofit News and Lion Publishers, local independent online news publishers. I think that the journalists in those newsrooms are doing really fantastic work. And I like to say that they're not your mom or dad's startup newsrooms. They have become very savvy about the business sense that they have to have. They know that this is not Field of Dreams. You can't just start a newsroom and expect to that readers will follow. You have to do the hard work of actually building a business. And Lion and INN have done a great job of supporting those newsrooms and building up those skills. And these are people almost exclusively who are coming from more traditional legacy outlets. So I think it's exciting. I also think, and Tamar can talk about this too, that there is, when newsrooms are closing, when newspapers are shrinking, there are other, outlets, not just online, that are coming in to fill in the void. NPR stations locally are doing great. Local television stations are growing and adding more, investigative reporting work that is really critical. And then we have some great examples, including the Eudora Times out of Eudora, Kansas, where, a journalism class in Lawrence, Kansas at KU, took up a town without news and is now, that's the class. They go and they cover the town, repeat. So there are some exciting partnerships and ways that, that space is getting filled. It's not the same as newspapers, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were just so many journalists who were so committed. You were saying it's kind of a calling. It is a calling, and journalists end up out of work and trying to figure out like how can they use their skills to serve the community and make sure that the journalism is there. So I think that's why you see some of the innovation, the startups, the journalists, moving from a newspaper to a public radio station or a TV station and trying their hand at new things. Again, because they live in these communities and want to make sure the community is served with good information. So it's been exciting to see, it's funny. It's like, it's disappointing that we no longer have the heft of the newspapers, but it also is exciting to see some of the new ways that journalists have, worked together to create some of these new startups. Here where I live, there's like Bridge Magazine, Bridge, Michigan, which is doing just amazing investigations and in-depth reporting that really has changed the conversation to some degree in Michigan. And that didn't exist 20 years ago. And now it's kind of a mainstay of the media landscape here. And I think we see this in place after place after place, to the degree that we forget that, Texas Tribune was a startup, and now it's just like a force in Texas reporting. So there have been some real success stories.
Great. And, on that line, we heard NPR launched an initiative for localized news podcasts. Can you tell us about that, Tamar?
Yeah. So, NPR and public radio stations, we've always worked together to create this mix of both national, international, and local news with the terrestrial radio stations that were all across the country. As more and more of our audiences started listening to podcasts, and NPR has been producing more news podcasts, we were trying to figure out, like, how do we make sure that local national tradition continues into the podcasting space? So with our afternoon podcast, Consider This, we worked with 12 member stations in 10 different markets to see if we could figure out how to make it a local national product. The trick was podcasting isn't quite there yet, so we were really pushing the limits of what's doable in podcasting. So using ad insertion technology, which allows you to localize a piece of content to a DMA, to a market area, we were able to create the first localized news podcast. And that's what Consider This is. So in major markets like Chicago and New York and LA, and even in Dallas, Texas, you can get local news along with the national news from NPR and Consider This. So we're really excited about it. It's getting good response from listeners. We've done some survey work, and listeners are just really thrilled to be able to get local news along with their national news in the podcast space. So we hope to do more with this. It was definitely an experiment, and we are kind of pushing the limits of what's possible. But as more people listen to podcasts, I think we are going to have to figure out how we work with the tech companies to make sure there is a way to localize, not just, provide a local podcast in one market, but how do we mix local and national together so that people get that range of what's happening across the national and the local spectrum.
It's fascinating. And
yeah.
On that note that you just mentioned of working with newsroom or working with the social media companies, we had and the tech companies, we had a question from Kyla Goucher asking, do you think social media benefits or harms local newsrooms in comparison to national newsrooms?
Ooh, interesting question.
Take that a few different ways.
I'm thinking, I'm choosing my words carefully. I think social media harms all newsrooms because it breaks it down to its most, basic and also sort of yellable pieces. And people often miss the nuance of what's actually happening. I think that the platforms appear to be trying to work with, newsrooms. We're seeing, what's happening right now with Facebook in Australia, and they claim they're platforms and not publishers. I think that we can agree to disagree on that, but I think it's great to have the opportunity to reach new audiences, and journalists should understand social media and all of the different platforms and ways to use them to engage with people. But the whole thing about social in particular is scale. What do we make go viral? What do we make people go crazy about? And the real value of local news isn't that it scales. It's that it's here and it's real and it's happening. And this is why you need to care about it. And so I think there are, in addition to all of the other things that, concern me about social media and the platforms in general, I think there are some competing values there that journalists, I think, are starting to pull away from and realize that, it's not about getting the most page views. It is about having deep and meaningful relationships with loyal audiences who want to come back and support you and share your work.
And because you don't have the scale, what then is the business model? And how do we make sure that if we are using social media to get more reach, how do we use it in a way that doesn't undermine the business model? Because we need the local journalism to be sustainable. So that's where you really do have to walk a tightrope in a lot of ways. Yes, there are some benefits in reach, but there are also some downsides too. And, it's hard to say exactly where the tipping point is, but there's some real trade-offs there.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. Aside from meeting virtual, what changes has NPR made due to COVID? Just, from everything from how you're producing and recording the audio to news production.
Oh my gosh. I mean, like everybody, we've had to figure out how to do so much more remotely in order to keep, our staff safe. Like that's been a huge priority, is how do we both keep our staff safe, but also serve the public? So it's figuring out, how do you do a lot more things remotely? How do you rely more on the network of member station reporters all across the country who don't have to get on an airplane to cover something and take that additional level of risk? So, it's really been a lot of the same creative thinking that I think everybody's been doing about who really needs to be in the office and what actually could be moved remotely. And are there some other ways to work with people to do an interview over Zoom and get somebody to show you around a space using Zoom instead of a reporter actually having to be there on the scene? That said, I think we all can't wait till a day when we can go back to the old way of doing business. I think there's so much more richness when you can spend a day with somebody in the field, really with them. And that's a lot harder to do these days because of the risks of COVID. But, I think just everything has had to be rethought, from how we cover stories to how we keep our reporters safe to how we, communicate. Like, normally these type of things might be in person, and here we are having this conversation remotely.
It's also exciting. The changes that we have not had choices about have, not all been bad. Yeah. And there are opportunities for, people who, particularly parents and caregivers, myself included. I've worked remotely for 13 years, which I know because that's how old my oldest is, and, would go into each newsroom that I worked in once a week. That's something that has been really important to me. And, I live at more than an hour away from the Poynter Institute and have always lived kind of far from my newsrooms. And I do think that before the pandemic, what I'm hearing is editors felt like, no, there's no way we can have a distributed newsroom and allow people, to maybe not live as close to the newsroom as we would like. And particularly with national newsrooms, I think there's a real value in having people embedded in communities, and particularly, in making sure that we're taking care of our parents and our caregivers and just allowing people to have lives. I don't think we're going to go back to the way things were before the pandemic. I think some of these changes will stick and be, I hope, newsrooms will be more flexible and just more, human. I hope all business places will be more human with how we think about, when you need to be in your desk in an office and when you can work basically from anywhere.
Which may actually have some interesting benefits to the national media if, more of their staff ends up distributed throughout the country. I work for NPR, but I've been based in Michigan. And I think in many editorial meetings, I've had a slightly different perspective on things because I don't live on the East Coast. And so, as we get to the place where perhaps there are more people, even at the national media, that are living all throughout the country, I think we're going to do a better job representing what it means to live in this country and a broader diversity of viewpoints across the country. And I think that will only strengthen the coverage that we can provide as the journalism industry writ large.
We have a question from Lambert asking, what's the definition of local? Can African immigrant outlets be considered local?
Oh, yeah. I actually, Lambert, this is such a good question. And I write a weekly newsletter for Poynter called Local Edition. And just today talked about this idea that, local means a lot of different things. It might mean where you live, but it also might mean the community that you're a part of, and that community could be part of a diaspora. And so, there are some great examples of these kinds of newsrooms. I would invite you to check out URL Media, which is a brand new offering from two really fantastic women who absolutely know what they're doing. And some of the examples of newsrooms that are serving immigrant communities, communities that are, tied together from both location, but also from different things like immigration, language, and, country of origin, or where you have, connections around the world. So I certainly think that local can mean any of those things. It's really about community and the different ways that we experience community.
Great, thank you. We have another great question from Jessica asking, what should PR professionals take into consideration when crafting pitches for local reporters?
Yes. Who does the story affect? What's at stake for people, not just for your company, but what's at stake for the audience? I think that is just such a key thing that I was always asking myself when I was working as a local journalist. Just really understanding why the story you're pitching matters to the people that are going to hear it. I always thought was like the number one thing I wanted to know.
Yeah, I agree. And make sure you're pitching it to the right person and not casting a net to the entire staff page. You're much more likely to get a response, if you are messaging a journalist about something that they actually work on and can make the case about why, their local audiences would care about it. I, every now and then, will tweet about some of the pitches that I get that are not about anything that I cover. And then, people follow up and start to get upset with me because I'm not responding. And so I think the thing to have some awareness and empathy for, Jessica, is that local newsrooms, this is before the pandemic, are a half to a quarter of the size that they used to be. And so, the communities haven't shrunk, the populations haven't shrunk, and the issues haven't shrunk. And so journalists at the local level have a lot less time to, deal with pitches that have nothing to do with their beats. So be thoughtful. And if you can't find the right person, the thing that I appreciate most is, instead of sending me a pitch, people emailing and saying, who at your organization should I reach out to? That takes me 5 seconds to respond to. And then, we've had a great interaction, and hopefully I've been helpful, and you can get to the person that you need to get to.
Great point. We have another question from Jenna, and this is something that you touched on a little bit, which is how do you think the pandemic will cause permanent changes to how the industry works?
There's so many, we're just getting ready to explore this at Poynter, but I have more questions than answers. But my questions are, will the reckonings that local newsrooms had around, how they cover communities of color and how they represent them, what will happen with those? Will it live past, 2020? We plan to cover that. What happens to newsrooms when there are no physical newsrooms? Lots of newsrooms have closed their buildings in an effort to save money and keep reporters. Are there ways we can rethink the newsroom space where we work? Does it have to be, an old building downtown with poor lighting? Could it be at the library or the coffee shop? Can we be more creative about how and where we work? And, can we be more remote friendly? Those are all some of the questions that I have, and I don't yet know the answers. So stay tuned. And I don't know, what do you think, Tamar? You probably have some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that. Can it be remote friendly? And what does that mean? If you're doing local journalism, do you need to live in the community? This will become a question as, people in dual income households, one person may want to live somewhere and the other person wants to take a job somewhere else, but they don't want to move there. And if you're doing local journalism, is that a requirement of the job that the person lives in the community? And I think on one hand, you can argue, well, yeah, they should, because they're covering that community. On the other hand, I've, heard people talk about, well, we could get, better editors if we allow them to be living anywhere they want. So I think that's something that local news is going to have to reckon with a little bit and decide what truly makes, the most sense. And does it vary job by job, community by community? There's some real questions there that I think we're going to have to grapple with.
Wow. Yeah, and I guess if the town hall meeting's happening on Zoom anyhow, you don't have to go down to town hall, right?
Maybe, but are you really, I think there are some things that really get lost when the journalist doesn't have a stake in the community and isn't sending their kids to that school. And, I think we get so many tips as we're walking down the street and somebody knows who we are. So I think there's so many benefits to living and working in the community. But I also can see the argument, when you are trying to hire in a place where there isn't a lot of, diversity in the community and you want a more diverse workforce, are you willing to loosen that up so you have some different perspectives on some of the issues? There really are some pros and cons that don't have always an easy, answer that I think we're really going to have to think about.
We have a ton of questions from the audience, and these always end at 45 minutes after the hour. So I'll see how many I can get to in the next 5 minutes. But after that, we'll tell you where to find everybody and how you can
lightning round time now.
Questions. Lightning round. Question from Sean Clare. NPR's a hybrid model of government grants, listener support, and ad revenue. Is that the future for all local news?
Well, I would say the government grants are very small. There is CPB support to some degree for some stations, but I think people think that's much bigger than it really is. So most of the support for NPR comes from listener support and from philanthropic support, and to some degree from what we call underwriting, which is kind of the public radio spin on ad revenue. My sense is that local news is going to have to look at a diversity of sources. And that's why NPR and public radio is funded that way, because we just need to have a variety of different sources and not have all of our eggs in one basket. So, yes, I think local news is going to have to turn to a variety of sources to be sustainable. I think it will vary market by market, what the balance is going to be. But that's my sense of it is, and I don't think government grants are going to be a big part of it, but I think listener support, sponsorship revenue, and then of course the philanthropic community is going to be a big part of it.
Great. Let's go on to a question from Shannon Hennessy. Advice on how to make a pitch stand out when COVID's become everyone's beat, like Kristen said.
I would offer it as, an alternative. I think you have to start by saying, hey, no, everyone's focused on COVID right now. This continues to be an issue. And so allowing these stories to exist side by side with the pandemic, acknowledging that there is also joy right now. There are also other things happening that are important. It's hard to imagine any story not having the shadow of COVID over it. But good reporters will find the stories that are there if you can make a clear pitch, I think. But you have to start by acknowledging where we are.
And make the case for why somebody should care. That's always key.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is a interesting question from Eric Makas. How do you think the argument for wearing masks will look once the majority of people are vaccinated in local businesses? Will people refuse to do business if you have to wear a mask and vice versa? So, it's massive become politicized. How's this going to play out with the vaccine?
God, not my area of specialty.
Yeah,
I know, Kristen.
I think that's gonna come down to local law, state and local laws, right? And so I also can't imagine how that will play out and see it enforced in different ways. But I think it's going to come down to how we interpret state and local laws. And as we saw in the early days of the pandemic, there are 1,000 flavors for that. So we'll stay tuned.
I have a question from Andrea Savin, elaborating on what Kristen said. How can press releases regarding COVID-19 stand out and be different while putting your brand in a positive light? Tough mixture to get, but
yeah, no, I have an easy answer for this, and that's tell me a real story. Tell me a story about a person. Help me connect with an individual that has a compelling story, and then let me do my job as a reporter, let the reporters do their job and tell the story from there. For our PR friends, you can't control where a story goes once you release it into the wilds of journalism. But, for me, just having a clear someone to connect with as a starting point is really key, because then I have a real concrete sense of where I could, go with the story once I do my reporting and my homework and research.
That's great advice. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. We had a huge number of questions come in, and more than we could get to. So, I'd like you each to share, if you could, how people can follow you, what you're up to. And then we have one final question from Lisa Kovitz, just asking, beyond being a subscriber or a member of great organizations like NPR, what else can people do to support local news? So where can we follow you, and what can people watching do to support local news?
Sure. My Twitter handle is, scrolling down the screen. It's at Tamar Charney. So I'm on Twitter. It's a great place to follow me. I would say just support local news. If that means, paying to get something that's behind a paywall, having a subscription, supporting your local public radio station or your local, nonprofit media outlet. I think just doing your part to help make sure that there is a sustainable business model so that journalists in local communities can be paid and continue doing the great work. I think that's really key.
I'm Kristen Hare, at Kristen Hare on Twitter. My email is khare@poynter.org. My inbox is always open. I'll do my best to respond to emails. I think, in addition to what Tamar said, really find local news that you want to support. Do it because it's worth it and also a public good, and be willing to participate when they ask you to, and be willing to challenge things that you don't think are working, editorial choices you disagree with. Just really participate, and that will help the local journalism itself be better.
Kristen, Tamar, this was amazing. Thanks so much for giving us your time and taking all these questions live here on the internet. And for everybody listening, thank you for tuning in. Thanks for all the amazing questions. And we'll be doing more of these. So follow Muck Rack, join the Muck Rack Daily, and we'll keep you posted when we have the next Muck Rack Live. Thanks again, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.